The Galactic Empire executed the woman general, and a 900-year peace died instantly. Part 1: The Last Salute. I did not sleep the night they executed General Mara Voss. Nobody did. I was sitting in the operations room of the carrier ship Endurance, 3 light-years from the Varath border, when the broadcast came through. The screen flickered to life without warning. No announcement, no preamble, just the cold white light of the Varath high chamber flooding every screen across 40 star systems at once. I had been reviewing fuel supply reports. I remember thinking how ordinary that was, in hindsight. Fuel reports, as if the galaxy were not about to change completely. She was already standing when the broadcast began. Mara Voss stood in the center of the Varath chamber with her hands at her sides and her chin level. She wore her uniform, not the diplomatic dress they had probably offered her. Her actual uniform, gray and worn at the cuffs, with the 3 gold bars of a Terran general on her collar and the small silver pin of the Voss family crest just below her left shoulder. She had chosen it deliberately. That was the kind of woman she was. Every detail was a decision. She was 53 years old. She had spent 30 of those years in service to humanity. She had negotiated the Aldara Corridor Agreement, which stopped a resource conflict that would have pulled 6 species into open confrontation. She had personally walked into a Vorath detention camp on Sector 9 to secure the release of 11 human researchers, using nothing but her rank and the particular way she had of looking at people that made them reconsider every assumption they had ever made. She had been the first and only human ever awarded the Varath Imperium Honor Seal, a disc of pressed starlight alloy that their High Council gave to fewer than 20 individuals in their entire history. They were using that same chamber to end her. The charge they read out was seditious consultation. The words meant nothing. They were legal decoration on something that had been decided long before any trial began. The Varath Empire had been quietly expanding its territorial claims in the outer reaches for 2 years. Mara had been the loudest and most credible voice telling the Terran Assembly what was coming. She had written 3 formal reports. She had presented her analysis to the Joint Species Oversight Committee. She had named names, cited shipping logs, mapped patrol routes. She had been, in short, exactly what a good general is supposed to be. And that was the problem. The Varath High Chancellor, a tall figure named Vreth Asen, stood behind the elevated bench in his ceremonial robes and read the verdict in a flat, practiced tone. Mara listened. She did not flinch. She did not look at the floor. She looked directly at the broadcast lens, which meant she was looking at every human being watching across the galaxy, and her expression was the calmest thing I had ever seen on a person facing what she was facing. I realized later that she already knew. She had probably known for days. She had made her peace with it, and she had chosen to stand in that uniform and look at all of us and say, without a single word, that she was not afraid and that she had done nothing wrong. The execution was not violent. The Varath do not do things violently when they are performing them for an audience. It was a pulse of energy from a suspended projector above her, clinical, swift. She was there, and then she was not. They cut the broadcast immediately after. No lingering image, no comment. The screen went black, and then it went back to whatever routine system data it had been showing before, as if nothing significant had happened. I sat there for a long time. My operations officer, a young man named Callum Hart, stood in the doorway. I did not hear him come in. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was 26 years old, and he had grown up learning about the Pax Galactica the same way all of us had, as the fundamental background condition of human life among the stars. 900 years of structured peace. 900 years of careful, deliberate coexistence, built on a treaty that Mara's ancestor, Commander Lyria Voss, had negotiated at the end of the founding conflicts. 900 years of humans choosing, again and again, to step back from the edge. Callum stood there, and I could see in his face the exact moment he understood that something was over. not just a person, not just a general, something larger, something that had held the shape of the galaxy together for longer than any living being could personally remember. I pulled up the Terran emergency frequency. It was already active. Every senior officer across the human fleet had been silently patched in the moment the broadcast ended. I could hear breathing. 40, maybe 50 people. No one was talking. We were all just listening to each other exist in the same stunned silence. Then Admiral Sira Akafer's voice came through, quiet, steady, the way she always sounded. She said, "Hold your positions. Hold your discipline. Do not act alone. We will speak soon." That was all. I closed the channel and looked out the narrow viewport to my left. Space was dark and still, the way it always is, indifferent to what happens inside the small metal ships moving through it. I could see the edge of the Vareth border marker in the far distance, a cluster of red navigation lights arranged in the imperial pattern, burning steadily as they always had. I thought about Mara Voss standing there in her worn uniform with her chin level and her eyes forward. I thought about 900 years. And I thought about what it means when you ask a patient people to be patient for too long. Callum was still standing in the doorway. I finally looked at him. He was waiting for something, not orders, not reassurance. He was just waiting for me to acknowledge that we both understood what we were sitting inside right now. I said, "Get some rest if you can." He nodded and left. He did not get any rest. Neither did I. I sat in that operations room until the next shift began, and I wrote 3 things in my personal log. The first was Mara Voss's name. The second was the date. The third was a sentence I had never expected to write in my career. They just ended 900 years of us being patient. I did not know then what that meant in specific terms. I did not know the scale of what was coming. But something in me, something old and quiet and very human, already understood that the Vareth Empire had made a mistake so large that no amount of diplomacy would ever fully measure it. They had looked at humanity and seen what they wanted to see, a species that talked instead of acted, a species that wrote reports and filed grievances and attended committee meetings, a species that had not started a war in 900 years and therefore, they concluded, would not start one now. They did not understand that those 900 years were a choice. And they had just helped us unmake it. Part 2, what we kept quiet. There is a question that people outside our species have always asked, quietly, among themselves, usually when they did not think any humans were listening. The question is this: why did they stop? They mean the early period, the first century of human expansion into deep space, before the founding conflicts, before the Pax Galactica, before any of the treaties or councils or border agreements that now form the framework of galactic civilization. They mean the era when humanity was moving outward with the kind of energy that does not slow down easily, building, claiming, pushing, making contact with other species in ways that were sometimes careful and sometimes not. They ask why we stopped. The honest answer, the one that most humans know but rarely say out loud, is that we did not stop because we were forced to. We stopped because Lyria Voss walked into a room 900 years ago and made a different choice, and every generation after her made the same choice, over and over, because we understood what the other option looked like, and we decided we did not want to be that. But here is the part they never quite understood. Choosing not to do something is not the same as being unable to do it. I have spent my career in the Terran fleet, 31 years. I know what our ships are built to do. I know what our training produces. I know that the average human soldier carries a physical endurance and a tolerance for operational stress that is, by documented medical comparison, significantly higher than most species we have encountered. I know that our engineering divisions have been quietly, continuously refining propulsion and weapons systems for 3 decades. Always within the technical limits that the Pax permitted, always careful, always measured, and always advancing. The Varath Empire mapped our active fleet every year. They counted ships. They assessed crew numbers. They ran strategic models. They knew exactly how many vessels we had and where they were positioned. What they did not count was the shipyards. 17 of them, distributed across human space in locations that were not secret, but were also never prominently discussed. Stations capable of full warship construction, dormant mostly, in the way that very large and capable things can sit quietly for a long time without announcing themselves. The infrastructure was maintained. The workers were employed on other projects. The systems were tested on a rotating schedule. We had not been preparing for a war, but we had never stopped being ready for one. The day after the execution, I received orders to report to Relay Station Delphi for an emergency assembly of the Terran Joint Command. I left Callum in charge of the Endurance and took a courier ship. The journey took 4 hours. I spent most of it reading Mara Voss's last 3 strategic reports, the ones she had submitted to the Joint Species Oversight Committee. I had read them before. I read them again. They were extraordinary documents, not because of their conclusions, which were correct and which everyone with access to them already knew were correct. They were extraordinary because of how carefully she had framed them. She had known, writing them, that she was describing a threat. She had also known that nomming that threat too loudly would itself be used as provocation by the Varath. She had threaded the needle perfectly. She had been specific without being aggressive. She had been clear without being inflammatory. And they had executed her anyway. Because she was right, and because a woman who is right in ways that are inconvenient to an empire is more dangerous than any weapon. Relay Station Delphi is not a glamorous place. It is a functional hub, gray corridors and recycled air and the permanent background hum of long-range communication arrays. When I arrived, the main assembly hall was already full. 240 senior officers, fleet commanders, and division heads. Most of them I knew by name. All of them I knew by reputation. Nobody was talking. That was the first thing I noticed. In 31 years of attending military briefings, I had never once walked into a room full of 200 people and heard nothing. There is always noise. People are social by nature. We talk. We comment. We check in with each other. We ask how the journey was. That morning in that hall, nobody said a word. They stood or sat and they looked at the floor or the walls or the middle distance, and they were each, individually, doing what humans do when they are very angry and very controlled at the same time. They were holding it. I found a place near the back and stood. Admiral Sira Akafer came in 7 minutes later. She was 61 years old, short and broad-shouldered, with gray hair kept close and the kind of posture that makes rooms reorganize themselves around her presence. She had served for 38 years. She had met Mara Voss 16 times by her own count. I know this because she told me once, years earlier, that she counted the meetings with people who mattered. She walked to the front of the room. She stood there for a moment, looking at all of us. Then she spoke. General Mara Voss was a soldier, a diplomat, and the clearest strategic mind of her generation. She was executed by the Varath Empire on a fabricated charge, in a public broadcast designed to demonstrate to every species watching that humanity can be managed, that our concerns can be dismissed, that our people can be removed without consequence. She paused, not for effect, because she was choosing the next words very carefully. They were wrong. Another pause. Recall every active treaty negotiation. Suspend all non-critical diplomatic exchanges. Wake every shipyard. That was it. No further speech, no call for discussion, no vote. Nobody argued. Not because no one had doubts. In a room full of 200 senior officers, there were certainly people with questions, with hesitations, with the reasonable concern that what we were beginning could not be easily stopped once it started. That is the nature of intelligent, experienced people. They consider consequences. But here is what I have come to understand about that silence. It was not agreement born of anger. It was agreement born of clarity. Every person in that room had spent their entire career working within a system that was supposed to protect what it had promised. A peace that was supposed to mean something. And every person in that room had watched, the night before, as the Varath Empire demonstrated that the system only protected you if you were powerful enough to make the protection real. Mara Voss had operated in good faith. She had filed her reports. She had used the proper channels. She had trusted the framework. And the framework had not saved her. The only thing that changes that calculation is power, not the appearance of it, not the promise of it. Actual, demonstrated, undeniable power, the kind that makes the cost of an action like what the Varath had done immediately and obviously too high to ever consider. We had not shown that power in 900 years, and a species that does not show its strength for 9 centuries eventually stops being believed when it says it has any. On the shuttle back to the Endurance, I sat next to a young fleet captain named Owen Price. He was 30 years old. He had never served in any kind of conflict. None of us under a certain age had. He stared out the viewport for most of the journey, and about halfway through he said, quietly, more to himself than to me, "I always thought peace was just what things were. I didn't know someone had to keep choosing it." I did not answer him immediately. I thought about Lyria Voss, 900 years ago, walking into a negotiation room and deciding what kind of species we were going to be. I thought about every generation after her that had made the same quiet decision. I thought about Mara Voss, standing in that chamber in her worn uniform, looking at the broadcast lens. Then I said, someone was always choosing it, we just forgot to notice. Owen looked at me, he nodded slowly. Then he looked back out the viewport at the dark space between us, and whatever came next. When I returned to the Endurance, Callum met me at the docking bay. He had clearly not slept. His eyes were steady though, clear, waiting. I said, "Wake the crew. Full operational briefing in 2 hours. We have orders." He said, "What kind of orders?" I looked at him for a moment. "The kind that don't get undone," I said. He held my gaze for a second. Then he nodded once sharply, turned on his heel, and went awake the ship. I stood in the docking bay alone for a moment. The bay was cold and smelled of metal and propellant, and the particular stillness of a vessel that has not yet been told what it is going to do. Around us, across human space, 17 shipyards were powering up for the first time in living memory. The lights in the corridors of the Endurance shifted from standard white to the amber operational tone that signals elevated readiness. We were not at war yet. We were becoming something that would be ready for it. And somewhere in the machinery of the Varath Empire, I wondered if anyone was beginning to understand what they had put in motion. I doubted it. You do not truly understand a force until you have seen it move. They were about to see it move. Part 3: The Shipyard's Wake. The first time I stood on the bridge of a fully armed Terran warship in active deployment, I noticed how quiet it was. That surprised me. I had expected something louder, something that matched the weight of what we were doing. Instead, the bridge of the Endurance hummed with the same soft, continuous sounds it always made. The air system cycling, the navigation arrays tracking, the communication channels open and waiting. My crew moved through their stations with calm, precise efficiency, the way they always moved. The difference was in their eyes. Every person on that bridge knew exactly what the amber lights meant. Every person had attended the full operational briefing. Every person had heard the words and understood the orders and had made their own private decision, sometime in the hours between the briefing and this moment, about what they were willing to do and why. None of them hesitated, not one. I found that more striking than any speech Sira Akafer could have given. We were positioned at the edge of Varath-controlled space, in a sector called the Aldara Corridor, which carried its name from the very agreement Mara Voss had helped negotiate 15 years earlier. The irony was not lost on me. The first zone of operation for the Terran Vanguard fleet was the territory that Mara had spent part of her career trying to protect through diplomacy. Diplomacy had run out. Owen Price commanded the frigate running parallel to us, the vessel called Aldenmore. He was nervous, I knew, in the way that careful and intelligent people are nervous before they do something irreversible. But he had a good crew and a clear head, and I trusted him. I had told him so before we separated at the staging point. The Varath garrison at Corridor Station 12 was not a major installation. Strategically, it was a checkpoint, a border enforcement post that monitored traffic through the corridor and maintained the Imperium's claimed authority over the passage routes. It was staffed by approximately 300 personnel and 6 patrol craft. Sira Akafer had chosen it deliberately, not because it was easy, because it was symbolic. It was a Varath installation built in space that the Aldara Corridor Agreement had designated as neutral passage. It was, technically, an illegal installation that had been tolerated because we had been tolerating a great many things for a long time. We were done tolerating. I gave the order at 0600 Standard Time. What followed was not the dramatic thing that people who have not been in military operations sometimes imagine. There was no shouting. There was no chaos. My weapons officer, a woman named Diane Park, confirmed targeting. My helm officer, a man named Leon Briggs, held our approach vector exactly as calculated. Callum coordinated with Owen's frigate over encrypted channel, cross-checking timing with the quiet intensity of someone solving a complex problem that requires perfect precision. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. At the end of 11 minutes, Corridor Station 12 had been disabled, its patrol craft neutralized, and a formal notification had been transmitted to the Varath Border Command informing them that the station was in violation of the original corridor agreement and had been decommissioned accordingly. The notification also stated that any further installations in designated neutral passage zones would be treated the same way. That was not a diplomatic note. It was a statement of fact about what we were going to do. I sat in my command chair after it was done, and I took a very slow breath. Diane looked over at me from her station. She said nothing, she just looked. I think she was checking to see how I was. I appreciated that about her. I said, "All systems report." She turned back to her console and gave me the report. Everything was functional. No damage sustained. All crew accounted for. Everything clean and organized and exactly as planned. I nodded. Then I opened the fleet channel and said, "Endurance to Aldenmore. Status." Owen's voice came back steady. "Aldenmore is clean. Operation complete on our end. No complications." "Good," I said. "Hold position and await the next coordinate package." I closed the channel. Callum was at my shoulder where he usually stood during operations. He said very quietly, "That's the first one." "Yes," I said. "How many more?" I thought about the operational plan, about the 17 shipyards that were currently completing the first wave of new construction, about the 43 other installations across the outer reaches that existed in legal gray zones the Varath had been using for years, about the fleet deployment orders that were already in motion, coordinated across more human vessels than had been assembled in a single operational posture since the founding conflicts, 9 centuries ago. "As many as it takes," I said. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said she would not have wanted this. He meant Mara. He was right. I had read her private logs by then, recovered from the Varath Chamber's own recording archive by an intelligence team that had moved very fast and very quietly in the hours following the execution. Mara had known for at least 2 weeks that the tribunal was coming. She had written in her log that she hoped the Varath would reconsider, that she hoped the charge would be quietly dropped, that she believed even then in the possibility that sense would prevail. She had not told anyone. She had not raised an alarm or sent a warning or tried to use her situation as leverage. She had not wanted to start anything. She had sat with that knowledge quietly and hoped the galaxy would be better than it was. It had not been. No, I said, she would not have wanted this. She wanted the peace. I looked out at the dark corridor of space ahead of us. But she also spent 30 years understanding exactly what we were capable of, and she trusted us to know when the time came. Callum did not reply. He went back to his console and began preparing the next navigation packet. Across human space, something extraordinary was happening. Species that had existed quietly under the shadow of the Varath Imperium for generations were sending signals. Some were formal messages of support. Some were unofficial, routed through civilian channels, carefully worded to avoid direct implication. Some were nothing more than the quiet repositioning of a neutral vessel out of a contested zone, a small gesture that said, without words, "We are getting out of your way." None of them had done anything like this before, not for us. What they were responding to was not our request for support. We had not asked for any. What they were responding to was the sight of something they had never seen before. Humanity moving, not talking about moving, not writing reports about the possibility of moving, actually directly, irreversibly in motion. A Varath diplomatic envoy arrived at Relay Station Delphi 4 days after the Corridor Station 12 operation. His name was Consul Adravith. He was a senior member of their diplomatic corps, experienced and intelligent, and he arrived with the kind of calm confidence that comes from never having needed to be uncertain in a very long time. I was present at the meeting because Sira Akafer wanted witnesses who could provide unfiltered personal accounts afterward. I stood near the back wall and watched. Adravith made his opening statement, which was long and formally structured and contained, near the end, the word proportionate. He used it in the context of an expected response. He suggested that the current situation, while regrettable, called for a proportionate diplomatic engagement that would allow both parties to return to a framework of managed relations. He said the word proportionate. Sira Akafer did not respond immediately. She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed. Not a large laugh, not performed or theatrical, just a brief, genuine, quiet sound, the kind that escapes when something is so far from the expected shape of reality that the body produces a response before the mind can select one. Adravith went still. He understood in that moment that he had misread the room, not just the room, everything. He had come prepared to negotiate from a position of quiet authority, expecting to meet counterparts who were upset but ultimately manageable. He had expected the kind of meeting he had attended dozens of times, where human representatives expressed their concerns with formal precision and then listened to reassurances. He had not expected to be assessed and found almost irrelevant. Sira let the silence sit for 3 full seconds after the laugh. Then she said, in a tone that was entirely pleasant and entirely without warmth, "Consul Adravith, we are not here to negotiate what is proportionate. You executed a Terran general on a fabricated charge in front of 40 star systems. There is no proportionate response to that. There is only what comes next." Adravith said, "I must caution that escalation." Sira said, "We are not escalating, we are correcting." He opened his mouth again. She held up one hand very slightly. "We will tell you what we intend to do. Then you will carry that information back to your High Council. That is what this meeting is for." And she told him, calmly, clearly, station by station, zone by zone, the legal violations the Varath had been accumulating in neutral and semi-neutral territory for 2 decades, and what we were going to do about each one of them. Adravith left 2 hours later. He looked, I thought, like a man who had walked into a building he believed he knew well and discovered an entirely different structure inside. On my way out, I overheard one of his aides say something to him in Varath that my translation unit caught as, "They were always this." Yes, I thought we were. We had simply been choosing not to show it. We were done choosing that. Part 4, 9 Centuries of Patience Spent. War, when it is real and sustained and large in scale, is nothing like the version that exists in the imagination. I had studied military history. I knew the theory. I had run simulations, read accounts, analyzed engagements with the detached precision of an officer preparing for something he hoped would never actually come. I thought I understood what it meant to be in a conflict that stretched across multiple star systems, that involved thousands of ships and hundreds of thousands of personnel and decisions that could not be revisited once made. I did not truly understand any of it until I was inside it. The Terran campaign against the Vareth Imperium did not follow a single clean arc. It was not a story where one side advanced steadily and the other retreated in orderly fashion. It was a series of overlapping engagements, some coordinated, some reactive, some improvised in real time by officers on the ground making the best decisions they could with the information they had in the moment they had it. I was part of operations in 6 distinct sectors over the course of 4 months. The Aldara Corridor was only the beginning. After Corridor Station 12, our fleet moved to the Osthen Passage, a commercial route that the Vareth had been quietly taxing human and neutral shipping for 11 years in direct violation of the free transit provisions in the original Pax agreements. We dismantled 3 checkpoint installations there. Then we moved to the Cradle Sector border regions, where Vareth patrol fleets had been making unauthorized incursions into the outer boundary of human-settled space with increasing frequency. Each operation was precise. Each one had a specific legal justification rooted in violations of agreements the Vareth had signed and then ignored. Sira Akafer had insisted on this from the beginning. We were not simply retaliating. We were correcting a record that had been allowed to drift wrong for too long. But I want to be honest about something, because the record deserves honesty. It was also a war. And a war, however justified in its origins, does things to the people who fight it. I felt it in myself, a kind of clarity that was efficient and focused and very useful, and also underneath, something harder than I recognized as part of who I had been before all of this began. I made decisions faster than I once had. I moved through the calculations of an engagement without the hesitation that used to accompany them. I was good at what I was doing. That competence should have felt neutral. It did not always feel neutral. 6 weeks into the campaign, we captured the Vareth Fleet Admiral commanding the Outer Reaches Division, a figure named Commandant Vrak Solon. He was brought aboard the Endurance after his command vessel was disabled in the Osthen Passage engagement. He was treated correctly, in full accordance with the multi-species protocols that govern the handling of captured command personnel. He asked to speak to me. I went to the secure observation deck where he was being held. He was sitting when I arrived, upright and composed in the way that senior military figures learn to be composed in unfavorable circumstances. He looked at me with the particular attention of someone assessing a situation carefully. He said in standard Galactic common, "I want to understand something." I waited. "We executed one officer," he said. "One. There are political considerations I will not pretend were absent, but she was one individual. The response you have initiated is," he paused, searching for the word, "disproportionate." I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "She was General Mara Voss." He waited, as if expecting the sentence to continue. I said, "That is the entire answer." He frowned. "That is not a strategic explanation." "No," I said, "it is not." He leaned forward slightly. "Then help me understand. We have fought species 3 times your number and twice your technological advancement. We have managed political situations of extraordinary complexity. We have dealt with threats and opposition for 400 years. Why does the execution of one human officer produce this response? What is the variable we did not account for?" I thought about how to answer him. I wanted to give him the honest answer, not because he deserved it, but because the question itself deserved one. I said she mattered to us, not just as a general, not just as a diplomat, as a person, as someone who spent her life trying to keep what was good about the peace intact. And you removed her in a public broadcast designed to show every species in the galaxy that we could not protect our own people. He said species lose individuals. That is part of political reality. Yes, I said, it is. And we accepted that reality for 900 years. We filed grievances. We submitted reports. We worked within a framework that was not always fair because we understood that the alternative was worse. I paused. The thing you failed to calculate, I said, is that we were aware of what we were choosing. Every time we stepped back, it was a decision, not a limitation, a decision. When you executed Mara Voss, you did not break our capacity. You broke our reason for choosing restraint. Solon was quiet for a long moment. His expression was difficult to read. Not angry, not dismissive. Something closer to the particular discomfort of a person who has just understood a mistake that cannot be unmade. He said quietly, "We did not believe you would do this." "I know," I said. "We had 90 years of data, modeled responses, probability assessments. None of them projected. None of them asked what we wanted," I said. "They asked what we had done. That is not the same question." I left him there. I heard later that he sat in silence for the rest of that day and did not request anything from the crew attending him. The personal log of Mara Voss had been distributed to senior officers by that point, with the family's permission. Her sister, a woman named Claire Voss who lived quietly on a farming settlement in the Bellin system, had authorized the release. She had said only, in the brief message she sent with the authorization, that she thought Mara would have wanted people to understand what she had been thinking. I read the log 3 times. Mara had been brilliant even in private. Her entries were clear and precise and occasionally, unexpectedly, funny. She wrote about the food in the Varath capital and how she had never managed to find anything in it that she would choose again. She wrote about a junior diplomat on her team named Petra Hollies who was, she said, going to be extraordinary given enough time and practice. She wrote about the Outer Reaches reports and her growing conviction that the situation was going to become serious if it was not addressed. And she wrote, in an entry dated 12 days before the execution, this: "I know what they are planning. I have known for a week. I have not told anyone in the fleet because I do not want to be the trigger for what telling them would start. I believe in the peace. I believe it is worth protecting even at significant personal cost. I am hopping, in the way that is probably not entirely rational but is very human, that they will decide I am not worth the political complexity of what following through will cost them. I might be wrong about that. If I am wrong, I hope the people who come after this understand that I did not think the cost was worth it. I still believe in the other option. I always will." I put the log down after that entry, and I sat without moving for a very long time. She had known. She had chosen silence to protect the peace, and they had done it anyway. I sent a message to my daughter that night. Her name was Nora. She was 17 and she lived with her mother on the Bellin station, not far from where Claire Voss had her farm. I had not spoken to her since the campaign began. I had not known what to say. I wrote to her, "I am doing something I cannot be proud of and cannot stop. Remember that both things can be true. I love you. I will explain everything when I can." She wrote back 4 hours later. She said, "Dad, I know, come home." The campaign continued. By the 3rd month, 12 of the Varath's illegally maintained installations in contested zones had been decommissioned. Their border patrols in unauthorized regions had been withdrawn, not by negotiation, but by the simple reality that attempting to maintain them had become operationally impossible. 3 of their core border fleet divisions had been disabled and were operating at reduced capacity. Other species were moving too, not fighting, not openly joining the campaign, but repositioning, quietly adjusting their treaties and passage agreements with the Varath Imperium, quietly opening lines of communication with the Terran assembly that had not existed before, a species called the Nalith, who had been nominal allies of the Varath for 60 years, withdrew their ambassador from the Varath capital and sent a delegation to the Terran station at Relay Delphi instead. The Imperium, built across 4 centuries of unchallenged expansion, had no framework for a war it could not slow down. They had fought conflicts before. They had won most of them, but they had always been able to control the pace, to negotiate pauses, to use their political weight to manage the tempo of a confrontation. We did not pause. We were not interested in tempo management. Sira Akafer ran the campaign with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. She did not grandstand. She did not make speeches for external audiences. She sent directives. She made decisions. She adjusted when situations required adjustment. She was, I think, the most effective person I have ever watched operate under sustained pressure. She visited the Endurance once during the campaign, passing through on a strategic coordination tour. We had coffee in my operations room, the same room where I had watched the execution broadcast 4 months earlier. She said, "How are you holding?" I said, "I am steady." She looked at me with the directness she always had. "That is not what I asked." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "I read Mara's log, the full version." Sira nodded. She had read it too. I said she did not want this. "No," Sira said, "she did not." Are we honoring her, or are we using her? The question sat between us. Sira said, "We are doing both. That is usually how it works with someone who matters. The reason becomes the justification, and you have to make peace with that." She finished her coffee and stood. "Keep your crew steady," she said. "We are close." She was right, we were close. The Varath High Council. After months of a campaign they had entirely failed to anticipate or manage, sent a formal communication to the Terran Assembly. They were requesting a conference. Part 5, What We Bury in the Peace. The conference room on Relay Station Delphi had been prepared with the kind of careful attention to symbolic detail that only matters when everyone involved knows that symbols are all that remain to be settled. The table was circular. That was not by accident. A circular table has no head, no position of authority built into its geometry. Sira Akafer had specified it 3 days before the conference began, and the station crew had found one in storage that was used for large crew gatherings, moved it to the formal chamber, and polished it until it reflected the ceiling lights clearly. I sat 2 seats to Sira's right. She had asked me to attend as a witness and as a representative of the operational command. I had asked her once if she was certain she wanted me there, given that I had been one of the officers who had led engagements during the campaign. She had said, "That is exactly why I want you there." The Varath delegation arrived on time, 5 members. Their lead negotiator was a figure I had not encountered before, a woman named Counselor Vesha Oran. She was older than I had expected, white-haired and thin, with the deliberate movements of someone who had been doing complex things for a very long time. She did not look defeated. She looked tired. That was different. She sat across from Sira, looked at the circular table for a moment and said, "Good choice." Sira said, "Thank you." Then the work began. I will not walk through every hour of that conference. It ran across 6 days, with sessions in the morning and afternoon and on 2 occasions through most of the night. The details were technical and intricate and mattered enormously. Border definitions, passage rights, legal frameworks for addressing violations, the decommissioning of installations and the return of assets, the question of accountability for what had been done to Mara Voss. That last one was the hardest. On the 4th day, Counselor Oran sat back in her chair and said to Sira, directly and without diplomatic framing, "We cannot undo it." Sira said, "I know that." Then, what do you need from this negotiation in regard to that specific matter? Sierra glanced at me briefly, then looked back at Oran. She said, we need it to be impossible to do again. Oran said, explain the mechanism you are proposing. And Sierra laid it out. A provision, to be written into the core treaty text, that no member species of the Galactic Compact could detain, try, or execute a citizen of another member species without a multi-species judicial panel, no unilateral authority, no closed chamber proceedings, no broadcast executions designed to send political messages to the watching galaxy. It would apply to everyone, including humanity. Oran listened to the entire proposal without interrupting. Then she said, this removes a significant portion of the Imperium's sovereign legal jurisdiction. Yes, Sierra said, it does. There will be considerable internal opposition. Yes, Sierra said, there will. Oran looked at her steadily. You understand that what you are asking will change the structure of how the Imperium has operated for 4 centuries. Sierra said, you executed a Terran general who spent her career protecting the peace between our species, and you did it on a public broadcast. You changed the structure of how we operate for 9 centuries. I think we are in a fair position to ask for a reciprocal adjustment. There was a silence. Then Counselor Oran said very quietly, yes, I suppose we are. The provision went into the treaty. On the 6th day, both parties signed the final document. It was given a name in the official record, the Voss Accord. I want to describe the signing room as I experienced it, because I think the details matter. The room was quiet. The lighting was steady. The document was displayed on a formal projection surface that had been set up at the end of the circular table, its text visible in 3 languages simultaneously: Standard Terran, Standard Verath, and Galactic Common. The senior representatives signed their sections in sequence. When it was Sierra's turn, she picked up the stylus and signed without hesitation, without ceremony, without a speech. Counselor Oran signed directly after her. They looked at each other across the table when it was done. Oran said, this is not how we expected this year to unfold. Sierra said, neither did we. Oran nodded slowly. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, I read the General's file, her record, her work on the Aldera Corridor Agreement. She paused. She was remarkable. Sierra said, yes, she was. We made a significant error in judgment. Sierra looked at her. You made the error when you decided she was a manageable obstacle. You have been making that same error about humanity for a very long time. Oran accepted that without deflecting it. She nodded once, stood, and led her delegation from the room. The memorial service for Mara Voss was held 3 days after the signing, at the location of her execution in the Verath capital. The Verath government had agreed, as part of the accord, to designate the site as a permanent interspecies memorial, accessible to all, maintained in perpetuity. Sierra gave a eulogy. It was short and precise in the way everything she did was short and precise. She talked about Mara's work, her record, the specific agreements and negotiations that bore her fingerprints even when her name was not on them. She did not talk about the campaign or the accord. She talked about the woman. Then I was asked to say something. I had not prepared remarks. I had tried to, the night before, sitting in my bunk on the shuttle that had brought me to the capital, and everything I wrote felt either too large or too small for the actual truth of what I wanted to say. So I put the notes away, and I decided to simply say what I knew. I stood at the front of the memorial space, which was clean white stone and open to the sky, and I looked at the assembled gathering, which included Terran officers, Verath officials, representatives of 6 other species who had sent delegations, and Claire Voss, who stood near the front in a plain gray coat and held herself with the composed stillness of someone who has been grieving for months and has learned how to carry it without letting it show. I said, General Mara Voss spent 30 years understanding what peace costs, not in abstract terms, in specific, daily, documented detail. She knew what holding the line looked like when the line was a legal argument in a committee room. She knew what patience cost when patience meant letting something slide that deserved to be pushed back on. She chose it anyway, over and over, because she believed in what the peace was supposed to be. She was right to believe in it. She was right about what it was worth. And she was right, I think, to choose the way she chose even at the end. I will not tell you that the last 4 months were what she would have wanted. They were not. She wanted the other option. She worked for the other option until the last moment she had. What I can tell you is that she trusted us. She trusted that we would know the difference between choosing restraint and being helpless. She trusted that if the worst happened, we would carry it correctly. I do not know if we did. I know we tried. I know the Accord carries her name because what it protects is what she protected her entire life. And I know that the best way to honor her is to make the framework she believed in actually work this time. Not because we are forced to, because we choose to. She always believed we could make that choice. I believe she was right. I stepped back. Claire Voss met my eyes from across the space. She nodded once. That was all she did, and it was enough. We left the Capitol the following morning. I stood on the deck of the shuttle as it lifted away, watching the city fall below us, the white stone of the memorial visible for a moment among the buildings, and then gone. On the journey back, I wrote a long message to Nora. I told her everything I had not been able to put into the short notes I had sent during the campaign. I told her about Callum standing in the doorway of the operations room, about Sira Akafer's laugh in the meeting with Consul Adravith, about Owen Price holding position in the Aldara corridor and doing his job with steady hands, about Diane Park checking my face after corridor station 12 to see how I was, about reading Mara's log and sitting without moving for a very long time, about 6 days at a circular table with people who had made a terrible mistake and were now being asked to help build something better out of the wreckage of it. I told her about standing at the memorial and saying the things I had not prepared. I said to her, I still do not know exactly what we were. I know what we had to do and why we had to do it. I know that Mara Voss deserved better than what happened to her, and I know that the Accord is the closest we could come to making something meaningful out of it. I know that the peace is going to take work, the same kind of work it always took, filing reports and attending committees and choosing, again and again, to use the framework instead of discarding it. I think we are better at that work now than we were before, because we understand in a way we did not before that the choice is always real, and the cost is always real, and someone is always paying it. Nora wrote back while I was still on the shuttle. She was 17 years old, and she wrote with the directness of someone who had been thinking hard about things while her father was away. She said, I read the Voss Accord, all of it, the legal language and the preamble and the provision about multi-species tribunals. I read it because you were part of making it happen, and I wanted to understand what it was. I think it is good, Dad. I think Mara Voss would have written something very close to this if she had been the one at the table. I think that is the best thing I can say about it. I read that 3 times. When I arrived back at the Endurance, Callum was waiting at the docking bay. He looked better than he had in months. The campaign strain was still in his face, but there was something else there too, a kind of settled quality, as if he had found a place to put all of it that was not quite resolution but was close enough to be livable. He said, how did it go? I said, we got the circular table. He blinked. Then he understood and he smiled, and it was the first time I had seen him smile in 4 months. We walked back through the amber-lit corridors of the Endurance together, and somewhere between the docking bay and the operations room, I felt the ship shift back towards something that was not quite ordinary but was aiming for it. The lights would go back to standard white soon. The crew would begin the transition to peacetime operations. Reports would be filed. Fuel supplies would be reviewed. The slow, careful, necessary work of coexistence would begin again. 900 years of peace had died the moment that broadcast cut to black. The Voss Accord was not 900 years of peace recovered. It was something newer and, I hoped, more honest. A structure that had been tested and had broken, and had been rebuilt with the knowledge of where the breaks had been. A framework that now carried in its legal text the formal acknowledgement that the lives of people in it were worth protecting, not because empires extended courtesy, but because the law required accountability. It would still require choosing, every day, by everyone inside it. But choice is what we had always been doing. I sat down at my desk in the operations room. Outside the viewport, space was dark and still, the same as it always was, indifferent to human history, waiting for whatever came next. I opened my personal log. I wrote Mara Voss's name. I wrote the date. And then I wrote the last thing I needed to say, for the record, for myself, for whatever version of the future might one day read it. We spent 900 years learning how not to be what we are. They spent 3 minutes proving we never fully forgot. And then we spent 4 months reminding ourselves that the hardest thing we can do is not what we are capable of. The hardest thing we can do is choose, again, to be something better. That is what she always believed we could do. I believe she was right.